Welcome to the Belly Button Window channel and episode 31, part 1 of the Jimi Hendrix story, like you've never heard it before. In this episode, we commence the deep dive into February of 1969, day by day and in detail, including the iconic Royal Albert Hall performances. Please remember to check the channel's community tab and video information page, where you will find links to related videos, performances, and stunning photographs from the period. Alexander G. of musiclips.com wrote, "From the moment he stepped onto the music scene, Jimi Hendrix's unparalleled talent was evident to both fans and critics alike. Even as he was carving out a name for himself, the appreciation for his exceptional skills was evident in the accolades he received. In 1967, at a time when rock was evolving and new talents were emerging, Jimi Hendrix was distinguished from the rest, being voted the Pop Musician of the Year by the discerning readers of Melody Maker. This was no small feat, considering the competition of the era. Then, in 1968, the iconic Rolling Stone magazine, a publication known not just for its coverage, but also for its rigorous standards in recognizing talent, bestowed upon him the title of Performer of the Year. Such endorsements, especially from a magazine with the stature of Rolling Stone, were not just accolades. They were powerful affirmations of Jimi Hendrix's place in the pantheon of rock legends. It was becoming clear that Jimi Hendrix was not just another musician. He was a force that was reshaping the very contours of rock music. Saturday the 1st of February, and Jimi Hendrix is voted Performer of the Year for 1968 by Rolling Stone magazine. Rolling Stone number 26, the 1st of February 1969. Rolling Stone magazine states, Jimi Hendrix, an American boy out of Seattle, went to England and headed a British band in 1966 and 1967. He spent most of 1968 back home in the States. When you went to hear him, you heard a lot more guitar and got a fantastic stage presence to go along with it, with a whole lot less bullshit in the bargain. Incredible guitar, blues players, jazz players, rock players, all were agreed that Hendrix's improvisations transcended category and constituted music as imaginative and alive as rock and roll has known. Jimi, more than any other player, has extended the voice of amplified guitar to an incredible new range of emotive sounds. And in Noel and Mitch Mitchell, he chose the perfect musicians to complement him. Hendrix simultaneously went farther out and closer to the core in 1968, blowing more blues than ever since the experience came together. His 3 LPs all rode high in the charts during the year. Are You Experienced, released in the fall of 1967, Axis, Bold as Love, released in spring 1968, and Electric Ladyland, the amazing 2-record set that came out in the fall. The first 2 albums only intimated the experience's full power, though the first was notable for Foxy Lady and Purple Haze, and both were first-rate rock and roll records. Both won gold records for their sales, but Electric Ladyland was the first Hendrix LP to reach top place on the LP charts, and deservedly so. The album had everything going for it. Generous parts of Hendrix's vaunted jamming, with friends like Al Kooper and Buddy Miles and Jack Cassidy and Steve Winwood along for the trip, a string of gassy new compositions, a beautiful performance of Dylan's All Along the Watchtower, which also did well as a single and all-around excellent production, especially on House Burning Down, where his guitar itself seems to be going up in flames, by Hendrix, who was his own producer. He celebrated his return to his native soil patriotically by creating a spaced, totally chaotic Star-Spangled Banner rendition, owing nothing to the more often heard American Legion Dar generations of school teachers' arrangement of the anthem. The only sour notes came late in the year, when Jimi was hospitalized with torn ligaments in his leg from a street accident, and earlier, when the Carnegie Hall management, fearful of what horrors of destruction his electric presence might summon, banned him. It was announced just as 1968 slipped away that Mitch Mitchell would go out on his own as a single. Though the drummer will still perform with Hendrix, for creativity, electricity and balls above and beyond the call of duty, he has won for himself the Rolling Stone Performer of the Year award. Tuesday the 4th of February, and a jam session at Steve Paul's The Scene Club in New York City, with Steve Berg on guitar, Jimi on bass, Johnny Winter guitar, David Cohen of Country Joe and the Fish fame on keyboards, and Buddy Miles on drums. The following interview with Johnny Winter took place in 1986. Johnny Winter, Steve Paul, who was my manager, had a club called Steve Paul's The Scene, which was the happening rock club in New York in 1968. All the nice-looking groupies were there, And the musicians were there because the chicks were there, so it worked out all right for everybody concerned. There were a lot of real interesting jams there, though how good they were would depend on what state of inebriation the musicians were in. Now, of course, as soon as I'd heard Jimmy's first record, I was in love with his band, so it was a natural thing for me to want to play with him. And he was real interested in slide, and so he seemed to enjoy playing with me. He never really made much of an effort to learn slide, though. As good as he was, I'm sure he could have done it. I think he had time booked at the record plant every damn night, and he'd get different people different nights. When the scene would close down, they'd go over to the record plant and put down jams. Then he'd listen to them the next day, when he'd be straighter, and hopefully get ideas from them. There weren't that many real tunes during the jams we had, but there was one guitar slim song called The Things I Used to Do, where I played slide and Jimmy played and sang. As far as I can remember, that was the only actual song we did. The rest of that crap, that Jim Morrison stuff, isn't really me. I never even met Jim Morrison. We did a lot of jamming at the Hit Factory, stuff that's on tape, but as I remember, there wasn't anything that could have been called a song. By the time we met, we both had our styles, but you can always learn something from anybody, and I'm sure that there are little things in my playing that I don't even think about anymore that are Jimmy. But a lot of those things would be because we listened to the same people coming up, so we really learned from a lot of the same guys, like Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters. Jimmy was really familiar with the blues. He could play good straight blues, and he knew all those guys. That's what he was, really. A great electric blues player. He just stretched it out. He had more chords. He didn't stick to just a 3-chord thing, but his playing was all blues. He had so much feeling, and he expanded it with the electronics. Some people want to call them gimmicks, but they're hard to work with. I get all goofed up when I start using that stuff, but Jimmy would hook up all these different things together and know how to work them. It was really amazing what he could do with them. It was like playing a whole other instrument. It was blues, but it was Jimmy. It was like 21st century music. He took ideas from everywhere, but it all came out Jimi Hendrix. There'll never be anybody who could do what he did any better. You asked what he was like as a person. Well, the main thing he was involved with were music and balling chicks, and he really didn't talk much to anybody about politics or growing up or whatever. He'd be friendly, but kind of distant, not the kind of guy you'd pull out your problems to. When you're that big, you just can't let yourself open to everybody. It's one reason he liked Billy Cox, because Billy really knew him, knew what he was like before it all happened to him. See, once you've made it, everybody feels like they know you, and it can be very lonely. Jimmy didn't have anybody who was just looking out after Jimmy. That was one of the main problems. Everybody wanted something. It's too bad that Jimmy wasn't looking out for Jimmy either. If only he'd had somebody to say, "Hey man, put yourself in the hospital for a while, get away from the dope, think about what you want to do." It would have made a lot of difference. But in those days, drugs were thought of as something good, and Jimmy was thought of as the king of that whole thing. Jimmy and Janice were the king and queen of the drug culture. They almost had to die, because you can't have a culture based on drugs. Toward the end, every time I'd see him, he'd look more and more depressed. It almost had to end the way it did. Wednesday, the 5th of February, still in New York City, Jimmy writes a 4-page memo, inscribed in pencil on yellow legal paper, regarding business and personal matters he wants to address. No, Steve Gold cannot do Albert Hall film on February 18th, if it's impossible to get rid of BBC, unless legal rights papers and agreements are conformed. If 24th Albert Hall England goes through conform to SOIC, we should, as you said, either abandon or really rethink the idea of the 3 individual groups' idea for 24th and stress in England. Phone call that if by all means possible, we should have previous day of concert, A.H. England, for ultimate private rehearsal in preparations for recording. Recording. Albert Hall, February 18th or 24th. Please try to find out definitely about who will engineer recordings. Very important. As soon as possible. Please tell Mercury Records to stop hassling over names and payment agreements, as far as Buddy Miles' Express album, Electric Church, goes. TV specials should be looked into, if not now, soon. We should have details on deals that we may be able to make, if any, and soon on the planning. I would like to see personal accounts on expense as close as possible to the present. Oh yes, almost forgot. Please make clear to Mercury, contracts included or whatever legal means, that in due time the Buddy Miles Express new LP will be one of the biggest for Mercury, and we are all, the group and myself, working very hard on it, and it would seem to be honestly fair for my name alone to appear as producer and receive normal producer's fee. If there are hang-ups on Anna Tanzi's side of the fence as far as whose name goes, where she may very well be represented on the LP as supervisor. I know a name on an LP jacket sounds like a small tut, rather an ego thing, but one of my ambitions is to be a good producer and extend. Therefore, that's one of the main themes in the idea of the name being there. Note, the original plan for the last experience was to produce a live JHE TV special, hence Jimmy's reference on this in his memo. While across the Atlantic on the same day, Noel Redding jams with Keith Moon of The Who on drums and various others at the Speakeasy in London. Friday, the 7th of February. Jimmy is interviewed for the Sunday Mirror at his London flat at 23 Brook Street, Mayfair. Then, Monday the 10th of February, and Noel Redding flies from London to Spain for a short holiday. Noel recalled, "Mike Jeffrey is being very friendly to me and lets me use his flat, which just happened to be on Mallorca." Tuesday, the 11th of February. At Mercury Sound Studios in New York City, Jimmy attends several recording sessions by the Buddy Miles Express and produces the following songs for their LP Electric Church, released late May and early June 1969, Miss Lady, 69 Freedom Special, Destructive Love, and My Chant. Jimmy commented, "I also did 5 sides for the Buddy Miles Express album. They are presentable enough, but not as good as I wanted them to be." Melody Maker, the 8th of March 1969. The song title 69 Freedom Special was coined by Jimmy. While Bill Rich, bassist Buddy Miles Express, had this recollection, a lot of energy was put into that session. It was so much fun that it was like a dream. I'm just sorry that it was edited down before it was put on the album, because there are a few more great solos recorded on that track. I was out of the service and just starting to get a lot of shit off my brain for the first time in 2 years. In the studio, I was telling Jimmy about my whole service thing, and he said, "Well, why don't you call this thing the 69 Freedom Special?" I agreed, because some of that shit I'm playing on bass I actually stole from him anyway. Wednesday, the 12th of February, and Jimmy flies from John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York City, to London's Heathrow Airport, England. Thursday, the 13th of February. Now back in London, at the Post Office Tower restaurant, Jimmy attends launch party for Mary Hopkins' postcard album. Also in attendance, Eric Barrett, Donovan, Linda Eastman, Kathy Etchingham, and many others. Richard D. Lello, known as Apple's house hippie at the time, had this to say: "Jimi Hendrix turned up after 7 p.m. as the party was on the last lap for a drink and some talk with Paul McCartney, and good-naturedly fenced with the journalists and photographers grown bored with taking Mary's picture." Friday, the 14th of February. Noel Redding flies back from Spain to England. While in London, Seymour Place, at the Seymour Hall, Jimmy collects his Disc and Music Echo Award for World Top Musician. Apparently the ceremony is filmed in black and white by Movietone News. Also attending, Maurice Gibb of the Bee Gees, who also presented the award, Noel Redding, Bruce Welch from The Shadows, amongst others. One magazine Disc and Music Echo contributor had this to say: "What's specially nice about Jimi Hendrix being chosen the world's best musician by Disc voters is that he is the first major rock musician to have put the idea of the all-star jam session into concrete form on record. Electric Ladyland must be one of the main reasons for winning the title. Hendrix, the boy from Seattle, Washington, has made it both commercially and, more important, musically, which, for all those who care about musical honesty, can only be the best news of the year." Disc and Music Echo, the 15th of February 1969. Saturday, the 15th of February, saw the Jimi Hendrix Experience at the Olympic Sound Studios, working on recordings for Room Full of Mirrors and Shame, Shame, Shame. Noel Redding recalled, "Went to pub for 3 hours until 8:30 p.m. Hendrix appeared late, couldn't get anything together again. Hugh Curry came down to the session." George Chkiantz, engineer at Olympic, remembered, "We did those sessions in Studio B, and I thought they were terrible. Hendrix was in a bad mood, but he wanted to do something." Studio B was the wrong place for Hendrix to record anyway, because there wasn't room for his sound to properly expand. It was incredibly difficult to record him there. He really seemed lost, and the whole thing was very sad. Sunday, 16 February, and back at Olympic Studios with recording for Room Full of Mirrors, Shame, 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 Crying Blue Rain, Message to Love, South Saturn Delta, Love a Man, and Sunshine of Your Love. Then, Monday the 17th of February, at Olympic Sound Studios, The group rehearses for the first Royal Albert Hall performance. The recorded rehearsals included the songs Spanish Castle Magic, Getting My Heart Back Together Again, Likely Lover Man, Likely Sunshine of Your Love, amongst others. Tuesday the 18th of February, at the 23 Brook Street flat, filming takes place for The Last Experience. Jimmy does a version of Hound Dog on acoustic guitar. Also in attendance, Steve Gold, his wife, Kathy Etchingham, and one other guy. Then, at the Royal Albert Hall, afternoon rehearsals followed by the 7:30 p.m. performance, and to top the night off after the gig at the Speakeasy, a jam with Dave Mason, Jim Capaldi and Alan Price. Photographer Eric Hayes recalled the Royal Albert Hall concert. Quite honestly, I must have been in a trance, because I remember very little of what was going on, except that I had no trouble getting into the hall, and my pictures are my diary. Backstage, Jimmy is interviewed by Bob the Raver Dorban for Melody Maker, published on the 22nd of February and 1st of March 1969 editions. Bob Dorban recalled, before his Albert Hall concert, Jimmy told me, "I just hope the concert turns out all right. We haven't played in a long time and we concentrate on the music now. As long as people come to listen, rather than to see us, then everything will be all right. It's when they come to see you doing certain things on stage that you can get hung up. I dream about having our own show where we would have all contemporary artists as guest stars. Everybody seems to be busy showing what polished performers they are, and that means nothing these days. It's how you feel about what you are doing that matters. I just cross off those people who are just doing it for their own egotistic scene instead of trying to show off another side of music. Say, wouldn't it be great to take over the studios like they do in Cuba? We'd call it the Jimi Hendrix show or else, and there would be no smoking in the gas chambers while we were on." Jimmy admits that he feels a little restricted by the trio format. "It restricts everybody, Noel and Mitch too," he said. "Now and then I like to break away and do a bit of classical blues." Jimmy laughed when I said, I thought I could detect church music influences in some of his things. "Spiritual music maybe," he said. "But if you say you are playing electric church music, people go gasp, gasp, or exclaim, exclaim. The word church is too identified with religion and music is my religion. Jesus shouldn't have died so early, and then he could have got twice as much across. They killed him, and then twisted so many of the best things he said. Human hands started messing it all up, and now so much of religion is hogwash. So much of it is negative thou shalt not. Look at sex. It's been screwed around so much I'm surprised babies are still being born. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to stop people from going to church, but as long as I'm not hurting anybody else, I don't see why they should tell me how to live and what to do." Another backstage interview takes place with Jimmy and Mitch, conducted by Richard Green for New Musical Express, published 22nd of February 1969 edition, which was titled Hendrix Plans Strip Shows. Richard Green explains, his idea is for an open-air concert where the audience can feel free to do as they please, and this includes taking off their clothes. Before his Albert Hall concert on Tuesday, he explained his idea. "I want to do it in the summer, a free thing in Hyde Park," he began, momentarily forgetting the clamor all around him. "It's not the idea of people coming and taking all their clothes off. It's just that if they want to, they can feel free, do what they want. Today there's too much hang-up on clothes. Clothes are okay to express yourself. You can wear bright clothes if you want, but the human body is the most beautiful thing. It shouldn't be kept covered." Resplendent in his usual black hat, with a brightly colored band and feather, green trousers and waistcoat, white shirt and red waistband, Jimmy spotted Madeleine Bell and asked her when she could do a recording session with him. She said, "Anytime, just call," and Jimmy grinned and replied, "We'll get some soul down." His dressing room, which he was sharing with Mitch and Noel, had now become occupied by a host of people, including Chaz Chandler and his lovely Swedish wife, Lottie, the amazing disappearing Mike Jeffrey, Dave Mason, former Speakeasy host Roy Flynn, promoter Dick Katz, record executive Ian Paisley, and Jimmy Holihan, among others. Mitch told me, "These concerts are okay, but I'd rather be on a tour, be on the road. Today it's just round the corner, do a concert and go home. You do a month in the States and feel shot at the end, but the first 2 weeks are great." The Experience's Royal Albert Hall performance included support acts, The Soft Machine, and Mason, Capaldi, Wooden Frog, in front of a sold-out audience of 5,000 people. Setlist for the evening: Tax-Free, Fire, Getting My Heart Back Together, Foxy Lady, Red House, Sunshine of Your Love, Spanish Castle Magic with Message to Love, Riff, Star-Spangled Banner, Purple Haze, and Voodoo Child's Slight Return. Noel Redding recalled, "We played Jeff Beck's Truth in the dressing room to get into the mood. Jimmy was relaxed and happy. Instead of his usual non-stop jumping, he played in a variety of poses and we went down well." While Richard Green reported, "So to Jimmy's act. In his field, he is a Segovia or Manitas de Plata, except that his guitar is electric." A packed house stood and roared their approval at everything he did, which surprisingly still included Purple Haze and Foxy Lady. Most of the time, the titles of his numbers were lost, but that wasn't important. It was enough to watch him and listen. His every expression, facial or musical, was a thing to behold, and his voice, while not one of the world's greatest, expressed his feelings as well. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Mitch Miller, as the program described him, was drumming as well as ever, and Noel proved that the bass player needn't always be regarded as the third or fourth member of a group. There weren't that many of the gymnastics we expected from Jimmy, but he scored just the same with what seemed a minimum of effort. While Mitch Mitchell stated, "The first Royal Albert Hall show was appalling. One of those gigs where you wished you could go back the next night and make up for it, but you had to wait a week. I don't know what it was, it just didn't feel good. But funnily enough, most people enjoyed it." Chaz Chandler remembered. "That was a lousy show, among the worst I had ever seen Jimmy play. And it wasn't his fault. It was Mitch and Noel's. They were lifeless. Mitchell's timing seemed totally off. He was coming in late so often it seemed like he was out of his brain, and Redding was just trying to show how awkward he could be. If I had been in charge, they would have been sacked the next day. Mitch and Noel wouldn't have done the second show, on 24 February. That would have been the end of it." The following is an excerpt from a more recent review of the February 18th Royal Albert Hall performance, based on the audio recordings. Listening to Tax-Free and Fire is unfortunately edifying. Mitch Mitchell is clearly under the influence of various consciousness-altering substances. We even have the impression that he's playing a different song than the other two at certain moments, as he is so far off the mark. It's unfortunate because Jimmy plays well, but he surfs on a vague rhythmic magma, where the tempo slips away under his feet at every moment. Then something obviously happens during Get My Heart Back Together, Hear My Trainer Come In. Within the title itself, there is an astonishing fluctuation in quality. After an introduction that is difficult to say the least, Mitch completely inside, we also hear Jimmy yelling at him, which he replays in rhythm. Jimmy obliged to retune. We are entitled to verses of very good quality, particularly well sung. As for the central solo, it is a monument of intensity, and this despite Mitch Mitchell, who we really feel is in difficulty during his breaks. Jimmy is literally burning here. He looks a little more at the end of the solo. The end of the title is astonishing. As can also be the case at Woodstock, Jimmy shows that he can single-handedly transcend a group, and this also shows the benefit of having good quality audio sources. It was impossible to hear what was really happening on the audience recording. Things improve a little with Foxy Lady, compared to the first two tracks. Is the effect on Mitch lessening, or is he more comfortable with these arrangements? On Red House, where we recognize the characteristic sound of the Gibson, Mitch's semi-comatose state paradoxically allows us to get a very precise idea of everything he normally brings to the composition, during the solo in particular. Mitch is so lost at the end of the solo that Jimmy picks up the last verse, playing the shuffle from the studio version on rhythm. Unsurprisingly, Jimmy is still on Gibson. The group continues with Sunshine of Your Love. But it must be admitted that Jimmy finds himself with a rhythm section that some fans would not want. Interesting. After the solo of Spanish Castle Magic, Jimmy launches the riff of what will become Message to Love, in a still very embryonic form. Performed mostly a cappella, the version of Star-Spangled Banner doesn't suffer too much from Mitch's excesses, but it's not the Woodstock version either. More broadly, the emotional impact of Jimmy's arrangements was never as strong as during the versions played in the States. Mitch is still not at his best on Purple Haze, which leads Jimmy to give the maximum during Voodoo Child, Slight Return. The finale played solo is notably longer than usual. Maybe this is a way of apologizing for his group's performance. That concludes this installment of the series. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we will continue the deep dive into February of 1969 of the Hendrix story, day by day and in detail in particular, featuring the second of the Royal Albert Hall concerts. Don't forget to subscribe for future content updates. And by the way, if you have any stories or anecdotes to contribute, we would love to hear from you. Until next time.